Thanks, everyone. If I could call those out in the hallway to join us back in the ballroom for our next panel, which will examine the current state of domestic liquid fuels, including biofuels, and the role they should play in a clean energy future. If everyone could please help me welcome Xan Fishman from the Bipartisan Policy Center to the stage, and he'll introduce our panelists. Xan, come on up.
All right, welcome back. So it's tough to go after the permitting panel because that's a really exciting topic. So we're gonna have to try to top that somehow, but we're here, we got a pretty blue couch, we got flowers. We just had a little break. I hope everyone had a chance to fill up the tank so we can talk about liquid fuels. I'm Xan Fishman with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And as you hopefully already know, we are a DC-based think tank, and our mission is to bring people together and find consensus on some of the most difficult topics facing our country. And in the energy space, that's how do we provide people with the energy they need that's reliable and affordable while decarbonizing, thinking about how to get to net zero. And that's a thing that we actually really can do on a bipartisan basis. And thank you to Crest for hosting this amazing event. Right now I'm gonna let each of our amazing panelists introduce themselves, and then we're gonna get right into the meat of the conversation. So Emily, start with you. If you could just quickly introduce yourself, please.
Quickly, good morning everyone. I'm Emily Skor. I'm the CEO of Growth Energy. We are the Bioethanol Trade Association. I represent the ethanol industry here in the United States. My members produce just shy of 10 billion gallons of low carbon ethanol every year. We purchase 20% of US corn, and thrilled to be here to talk about the very vibrant and important future of liquid fuels in this country and really globally.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tanya Vetter. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Planning for ExxonMobil's Product Solutions business. So that's our fuels, our specialties, and our chemicals business. And it's an honor to be on this panel today.
Amazing. So let's start with the big picture. We're talking transportation here. And there is a lot of attention on electric vehicles. And I think electric vehicles are going to be a really big factor in decarbonizing transportation over time. But they're unlikely to be the whole picture, unlikely to be the whole solution for a variety of reasons. And there's, I think a good reason to think that liquid fuels are going to play a significant role for the coming decades and quite possibly longer than that. So can you just start by explaining, from your perspective of each of your companies, what is the role that you think liquid fuels are going to play over the next few decades, and how do they fit into a decarbonization strategy? Emily?
Okay. So yes, we are on a path towards low carbon, toward net zero carbon emissions and beyond as a nation, as a globe. And yes, there is going to be continued electrification. And in addition, there is no path to net zero without a very strong role for liquid fuels to play. So just in the light duty vehicle sector, cars and trucks on the road, by the most aggressive, ambitious estimates, in 2050, 40% of new car sales will continue to be the internal combustion engine. The dominant vehicle on the road will continue to be powered by an internal combustion engine. And so you're right, there's a lot of attention, importantly, on how do we make sure that we're on a path towards electrification, but let's not forget that we can decarbonize the liquid fuels. What can we do with the cars and the trucks on the road today and tomorrow, and what can we do that is affordable and accessible to the American consumer?
Tanya?
Okay, so I'm going to go really big pictures, and I'm going to start with global population. So global populations will grow, and as the population grows, so will the demand for energy, reliable, affordable energy, and also the need for greenhouse gas emission reduction. And I would say that liquid fuels, lower emission fuels, can play an important role in both of those, in meeting the demand for energy and also reducing emissions. If you just take a simple example of the vehicles that are on the road today, you can power those vehicles with lower emission fuels and reduce the emissions. If you look at some of the sectors that are more difficult to decarbonize, like the marine sector, so the large vessels, the container ships, cruise ships that travel big distances, they're going to need lower emission fuels. The aviation sector, aircrafts will be powered by sustainable aviation fuel. So it's really important to have liquid fuel solutions to both meet the demand and reduce the emissions. And don't get me wrong, we think that EVs have a very important role to play. And at ExxonMobil, we're working on everything from lithium to carbon capture and storage, lightweight plastics to increase EV range. So in short, I would say we need all of the technology solutions and really sound policy in support of that.
And I should add, I should have said this at the outset, just to establish a baseline of understanding of low carbon ethanol. Ethanol as a baseline cuts the carbon intensity of our fuel in our cars and trucks by about 50%. And we as an industry are on path towards zero, getting zero and beyond. So as a baseline, already we are decarbonizing liquid fuel because you're blending ethanol and gasoline together. You blend more ethanol, you're going to have an even lower carbon liquid fuel. So again, there are some pretty low-hanging fruit opportunities that we don't want to miss out on those opportunities for the American driver as we're also doing dual-track approach. Because I think the theme that you're hearing across the board is there's no silver bullet, there's no panacea, there's no one single thing that will decarbonize cars and trucks, and certainly not maritime, long-haul trucking, or aviation.
No thing at the bottom of the webpage. This one weird trick is going to solve all our problems. No. Okay. So digging in on your last point there, biofuels have actually been a source of pretty big controversy in terms of their effect on overall sustainability and overall emissions impacts. And a lot of that is around indirect land use change. Emily, in your opinion, what's the best way to think about those issues as they relate to biofuels?
Sure, and thank you for asking. So indirect land use change. So it's the notion that if you're using a crop as the feedstock for biofuels, using that crop is going to have an impact somewhere else on land use. And that was the premise of a lot of policy and modeling thinking in the early days when we first started making biofuel in the US. It's turned out to be a false premise. And it's been disproven repeatedly by hard data. If you look back, we have not changed the number of acres that we are using to grow corn in this country actually in a century. We are using the same amount of acreage that we've been using since the 1930s. It hasn't changed as we've ramped up to 15 billion gallons of production of biofuel, of ethanol in the country. What's changed is the yield on the farm. The yield of those corn acres has increased sevenfold in that time. So that's where the technology and the innovation is taking place. So a lot of it comes down to educating on some of the modeling and thinking as we were anticipating ahead. Okay, well, let's look at what the actual data are telling us as we look back on the real world implications of what we're doing on the production side.
I think that's really interesting. And, thinking about like what are the effects of our actions? If we choose to use land in some way, does that make some other person in some other state or some other country use land in a different way? And to what extent is person A responsible for the later actions of person B? I think it's a really interesting question, and we're going to get to the policy soon. That's the thing I love, obviously. But before we do, let's think a bit about where people are spending money, right? Because I think a lot of times when we're thinking about what's the future, looking at where the dollars are flowing is a pretty clear indication of like what people right now think the future is. What are they willing to invest their capital in? What are they going to build? What do they think people are going to be using in the future? So Tanya, when you're looking around the U.S. and around the world, you guys are global. Where are you guys making investments in this biofuel space, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question, Xan. So ExxonMobil and our affiliates around the globe are looking at a wide range of opportunities to produce lower emission fuels. These opportunities range from new construction, so building renewable diesel facilities, to co-processing, where you use existing infrastructure to blend biocomponents with traditional fuel components to make lower emission fuels, or reconfiguration of some of our existing assets to equip them to run on biofeedstocks. And I'd say where we're making the investments and the pace that we're making the investments depends on where there's demand. So where there's a consumer that wants to buy the products. And there tends to be a strong correlation between demand and policy. So where policies are in place that are encouraging innovation and technology and that are spurring demand, we're making investments. You can take Canada, for example. So Canada has a clean fuels regulation. And that regulation sets a standard for carbon intensity reduction on fuel. And so our affiliate in Canada, Imperial Oil, is building a 20,000 barrel a day renewable diesel facility. And that's to support the demand and innovation in Canada aligned with that policy. I think another example of a policy where you don't necessarily have a federal standard would be, take New Mexico, a state-level low-carbon fuel standard in New Mexico. It's a market mechanism, it's CI-based, and it's designed to encourage reduction in carbon intensity. So the key thing is that you have sound policy to encourage the innovation, to drive the demand, and the investment will follow.
That's such an important point. Demand. We at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we wrote a white paper on this last year, actually, of like the various demand tools that are available to both institutions and governments to drive certain types of investments and behavior. And without clear demand signals, like companies aren't going to invest. It's just not going to happen. So then the question is obviously, what's the right tool? What's the right tool to encourage demand in a way that is good for consumers, is good for businesses to be able to invest, and then obviously sometimes you have other goals you're trying to achieve at the same time, right? For instance, decarbonization. And so when you're thinking about demand, one of the policy levers in this fuel space that exists in some states, as you mentioned, is a low carbon fuel standard. And a low carbon fuel standard is basically a signal from the government that the intensity on average of your fuels needs to decrease by a certain amount each year over time. And then the market figures out how to respond to that. What do you think about the idea of having a national low carbon fuel standard? Emily, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, that's an idea that's absolutely has been being talked about for some time. Anytime, of course, you have broad federal policy, the devil is in the details. But let me start out the outset. What is the most important thing that we have to get right is the measuring stick. We're all talking about carbon. Let's be very clear-eyed about the goal, and then let's not pick winners and losers. That's not what we want the U.S. government to do. What we want the U.S. government to do is say, our goal is low carbon. We're going to measure you by performance. Okay, innovators. Okay, private sector, get going. And let's see who can drive there the fastest. So what's really important is that when you're looking at how we measure carbon intensity, a couple things. The modeling is going to be really important. The Department of Energy, Argonne National Labs GREET model is the gold standard in terms of carbon intensity modeling for the United States because it is updated annually. It has the most inputs. It's incredibly rigorous. And so it will account for the most instances of innovation. And I'll just kind of talk from the biofuels sector. What's really important is that we recognize all the ways that an ethanol plant in the biorefining process that we can reduce our carbon intensity. And agriculture farming, that's half of the carbon intensity of ethanol. Half of it comes from what we're being measured in terms of what's taking place on the farm. And so there are things that farmers can do in terms of regenerative agriculture, but we've got to give them credit for that. So the model has to account for this. Then you also need, if you're comparing technology versus technology, you need to be apples to apples. So we would call it a well to wheels. When we're talking about liquid fuels, we are evaluated from everything that happens on the farm all the way to the combustion of the fuel in the car. And so if you're talking about electrification or anything else, let's look up and down the supply chain, the value chain, to make sure, again, that comparison is apples to apples. So the end user, the consumer, the government, the policymaker understands we actually are achieving our goal. We are driving down carbon performance. So making sure that we have a good measuring stick, that we get those details, that we give the private sector and businesses the flexibility to innovate and perform against that standard is really important.
And can I just push a little bit? So the details matter. Really agree. If you care about policy, you got to get it right. It's fairly easy to write bad policy. It's difficult to write good policy. That's the challenge. So let's assume we get the details right. What do you think about the overall mechanic of the tool? Do you think that it would be a good path for the United States if we could get the details right to have something along the lines of a low carbon fuel standard nationally? Is that still to you, Emily?
Okay.
Yeah.
It can be right. It can be. I mean, and also it gives us a uniform standard. And so, and I think there's a lot of conversation right now, okay, what happens with the outcome of the election? But the truth is the states are doing a lot on their own. California, Oregon, Washington, and New Mexico all have a low carbon fuel standard. So we are selling fuel into those markets. We need to be able to meet those markets. About 13 other states are looking at low carbon fuel standards. Canada, which is our #1 trading partner, is low carbon. And so we know that we have to be able to compete. What's nice to contemplate about a federal policy is again, it gives you a uniform measuring stick, a uniform standard. And I think there could be a net benefit there for the fluidity of our fuel demand in our marketplace.
So Tanya, over to you. Just big picture, national low carbon fuel standard. What do you think about that idea? Would it be good? If it would be good, what we need to think about to get it right? How do we do it so it's not bad policy?
Okay, so I would say in the absence of an economy-wide carbon policy, a federal low carbon fuel standard can be very beneficial and impactful. But the design is paramount, like you say, and a number of the elements, Emily, that you called out, we would agree with. So first, it needs to be market-based, and it also needs to be based on carbon intensity. So you need to be measuring the right thing with the right measuring stick, as Emily said. And so essentially what that means is you establish a carbon intensity reduction standard, and you create a market-based system for trading credits. So the economy and the innovation and the technology are motivated to advance. Life cycle based, so Emily talked about this. So from end to end, so whether the energy is electricity or whether it's a liquid fuel, you need to count the emissions from the beginning all the way to final consumption. And then technology neutral. It needs to be open to all technology and not picking favorites. And I'd say, Xan, the way to make it even more impactful is to pair it with a vehicle standard. So a vehicle standard that, again, is life cycle based and technology neutral. That might mean rethinking some of the EPA's tailpipe rules or the NHTSA CAFE rules in order to create a policy framework that can be more effective. So there's considerable work to be done in this space, and we're certainly committed to working on that.
That's really interesting. Could I ask you to follow up just a little bit there? So right now we've got CAFE standards. There's these efficiency standards, and we're talking about potentially having a national fuel standard. And you're suggesting that they could really that instead of having the CAFE standards, you could instead, if I heard you correctly, have an efficiency standard on vehicles combined with the fuel standard. Why is that a better approach than what we currently have?
So the current approach is very narrow, and it's not accounting for the full carbon intensity and the full emissions. And so an approach that looks at life cycle end to end will be far more effective. And it'll also benefit the existing fleet. So new vehicles, of course, are very, very important, but there are a lot of vehicles on the road today. And standards for new vehicles alone will not generate the same benefit that a policy would if it applied to the full fleet of transportation vehicles.
And can I add here too? I mean, one of our chronic long-standing frustrations with the emission standards and the tailpipe standards is that they aren't recognizing what you can achieve if you look at the fuel and the engine as a system, and recognizing what you can do when you account for both. If you're only measuring the emissions, the tailpipe emissions, you're missing an opportunity, again, to recognize what the rest of the industry can achieve and what we can achieve in terms of cleaning the emissions, the total emissions. So anyway, just wanted to add that. That's good.
Terrific. So sounds to me like ExxonMobil and Growth Energy, who historically haven't always agreed on everything, are both interested in this idea of a national low carbon fuel standard. I think that's really interesting. But demand isn't the only policy that's really important. There's many more policy areas that affect your industries, that affect your fuels. So if people are walking out of here thinking about what policies should I really be caring about right now, what are the other policies right now that are either creating good incentives or are barriers to the types of investments that you think we should be making? Let's start opposite direction this time, Tanya.
Okay, sounds good. Well, so I'll give one example and then give it over to Emily. But I mentioned earlier the importance of sustainable aviation fuel to decarbonize aviation. And I think we need to recognize that sustainable aviation fuel is more complex to make. The feedstocks cost more than the feedstocks that we use today for traditional aviation fuel, and so it will cost more. In order to incentivize the innovation, the investment, and the demand, policies like the Inflation Reduction Act that create some incentives will be important. We think it's important, though, that those policies do have an end, but the end to be far enough into the future that it allows for the cycle to evaluate, develop, and execute the technology and move it into the market. So I would say that policies that create incentives, in addition to the market-based policies, will be important.
Emily?
It will dovetail beautifully. I'm going to give an example of one such policy. Here's your shorthand, 45Z. That's what you need to remember. It's the Clean Fuel Production Tax Credit. The beauty of it is, as we've talked about, it is technology neutral. Whatever you do to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel, you will, and we're incentivizing. It's not a requirement, it's not a mandate. We are incentivizing this performance. And so the challenge, however, is this. The good news is we have this tax credit. The challenge is twofold. One, we don't know the rules of the road yet, so we are still awaiting, as an industry, from guidance from Treasury. So we really need to get that guidance out so we understand, all right, if I do A, what will that mean in terms of reduction in carbon intensity? What will I get for a tax incentive? Is it worth a capital investment? We're talking about hundreds of millions of billions of dollars in investment that will be worth it, but it's not quite economical right now, in particular for SAF. So we need the guidance to come out that, again, recognizes there are 19, Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz just came out with research last week, and it was specific to ways to decarbonize ethanol. He identified 19 different pathways that you can decarbonize. But we need those 19 pathways to be included in the Treasury guidance so we can get going on the innovation. So we need to know the rules of the road. We also need, as Tanya said, we need a time frame that makes sense. We need a glide path. And 3 years is just not long enough to be able to get going on everything that we need to do. So there was, fortunately, there were bipartisan, bicameral bills introduced earlier this week that extend that 45Z timeframe. So it's actually consistent with many of the other tax credits that were passed a few years ago as part of the IRA. And I can't resist following in on the last panel. I just have to talk a little bit about permitting too.
Oh, please do.
Okay, can we
Please
go there? Because I loved the last panel, but let's talk about the permitting to sequester carbon, okay? We, in the liquid fuels industry, we have the ability, you can capture that carbon and you can sequester it. On the ethanol side, it's biogenic. It's really clean. We can capture it, sequester it. That cuts our carbon intensity in half. The time frame to get the permit from EPA, it was supposed to be 2 years, and now it's 3 years. And so here's a couple numbers for you. EPA has issued 8 permits for this Class 6 injection well. And everybody knows carbon sequestration is a huge component. It is an important technology in our ability to make an impact. They've issued 8 permits. 3 states have primacy. They collectively have issued 11 permits. EPA has over 130 permits pending, and that time frame keeps getting longer because there's a huge backlog. Now, we can't start decarbonizing and getting ourselves in a way that we're a feedstock for SAF until we can actually sequester. So I very much agree with the themes of what you heard about on the earlier panel.
Permitting reform and carbon sequestration, these are just topics that are near and dear to my heart. So thank you for raising those. And you know, these class 6 wells that are where we sequester the CO2 underground, we've been doing it for quite a while, and it's very safe. Right? We have amazing geology in the United States that can sequester the CO2 underground safely, where it can't contaminate anything, and it won't leak back into the atmosphere, right? Getting that CO2 out of the cycle, which is just a really big deal. And, you know, I just want to just ask, you know, when you're thinking about the investments that you want to make, and you're looking at a permit for a class 6 well, and you don't know if it's going to take 2 years or 3 years, how does that affect you? How does that affect the decision making and the capital and the costs to you as a business? And then obviously, how do those transfer down to the consumer who wants to eventually buy your fuels?
Sure, I'll go first, but just with the very basics of the fact that it takes longer, requires more time and effort, of course, increases the cost. And so we will be investing where there's greater certainty, greater expedience, and opportunities to be most effective in the quickest amount of time.
I mean, speaking on behalf of my member companies, we're just kind of suspended in air right now. And the businesses have done all that they can do in terms of the testing and the application. But to put steel in the ground, to make these investments that are tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, you need to know there's going to be a marketplace for what you're creating and what you're doing. And that's where the road does come back to Washington in terms of having tax incentives, in terms of making sure that if the government is saying this is a priority, the government has a permitting process that reflects that that is a priority that we are all trying to collectively achieve.
So we've talked about demand. Are there consumers that want to buy your product at the price that you're able to make it? And are there policy levers that the government has available to align that demand with decarbonization goals? We talked a little bit about supply side incentives, right? You know, the 45Z clean energy tax credit from the Inflation Reduction Act to produce the clean fuel. We've talked a little bit about some barriers, permitting. We talked about class 6 wells. We didn't talk about broader permitting woes, NEPA and judicial review, CO2 pipelines, though we could. When you're thinking about the bipartisan path forward, and if you're talking to the policymakers right now, for all the policymakers that are tuning in online, all the Hill staffers who are watching from their computers, all the people in the room, just big picture, like what's the one final closing message that you want them to hear about the need for liquid fuels and the role of policy in achieving the kinds of investments into the clean fuel future that we all want to see? We'll start with you, Emily.
There's a critical role for liquid fuels to play on the path toward decarbonization. And the value that we bring is you don't have to buy a new vehicle to be able to use it. It's affordable, it's accessible, we can do it today, and it is clean, and it will become cleaner energy as we continue to innovate. So we are a critical tool. And in the conversations that I have, if we're talking to Republicans and Democrats, there is a recognition and a desire. We want clean energy. And I think, perhaps on different terms, I think you hear in terms of kind of after clean, how much of this is about what's affordable and accessible. But the fact of the matter is drivers are already benefiting from using liquid fuels, low carbon liquid fuels. Ethanol continues to drive down in terms of carbon intensity. It's also lower cost. If you fill up with a 15% ethanol blend versus a 10% ethanol blend, you're saving about 15 cents a gallon. That's not nothing if you look at what the conversation at the kitchen table is today. So there are solutions. Again, they're low cost, they're available, they're affordable. This is what we wanted. And it's not there are other things too, but we want to keep driving towards the path forward. And I think also where I do hear some kind of consensus bipartisan consensus is on sustainable aviation fuel. That is a hard to abate sector. We're not going to be electrifying aviation anytime soon. And so we have the ability to provide sustainable aviation fuel that meets the demand of the airlines. The airlines have been very clear. There are a lot of airlines that have put goals and said, we want to be able to provide this. We just have to make it economical and scalable. And that's where government support, clarity in terms of market opportunity, and government incentives have a huge role to play in our ability to help get the airlines where they want to take their customers.
Terrific. And we're just over time. Quick closing, Tanya.
All right, I'll be quick. I would just close by saying that there are opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that will require all technologies. So we need to be open to all technology, including lower emission fuels. And a low carbon fuel standard can achieve that and maintain consumer choice on the vehicles that they want to drive. So thanks, Ann.
Terrific conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And please give them a round of applause.
Thank you all so much. We have a short break. Congresswoman Miller Meeks, you've obviously seen in the program, is supposed to be speaking right now. She actually spoke yesterday due to vote schedules. But in this break, I encourage you all who are going to